Lyra had always believed that her home was a place of peace, a planet full of technology, beauty, and harmony. But that belief shattered the day she was exiled. Her people, once proud of their achievements, turned against her after a series of misunderstandings. She had been accused of crimes she didn't commit. So the council decided to send her away. Exiled to a planet far from home, Lyra had no idea what she would face. All she knew was that it would be a long time before she could return. As her ship flew through the endless darkness of space, she stared out of the window, lost in thought. The stars passed by in a blur, and soon the glowing blue and green of her homeworld disappeared. The planet she was being sent to, according to the council's records, was one known to be dangerous and remote. They had called it a forbidden world, a place where few dared to venture. Lyra felt a deep sense of loneliness settle in her heart. She wondered how she could survive alone on such a planet, without any help from her people. The ship began to shake violently, snapping Lyra out of her thoughts. A warning light blinked on the control panel, and a loud noise echoed through the craft. She quickly looked at the readouts, her heart sinking. The ship was losing power, and the controls were unresponsive. Lyra tried to regain control, but it was no use. She could only hold on as the ship spiraled down toward the surface below. With a loud crash, the ship slammed into the ground, tearing through the thick atmosphere of the alien world. The impact threw Lyra against the seat restraints, and everything went dark. When Lyra regained consciousness, her head throbbed painfully, and the air smelled of burning metal and dust. She slowly opened her eyes, blinking to clear the blurriness. The cabin of the ship was wrecked. Panels were torn apart, and debris littered the floor. She was in pain, but she forced herself to move. Her hands were shaky as she unbuckled her seatbelt and struggled to stand up. Her legs felt weak, but she managed to take a few steps. Outside the broken windows, the sky above was a strange shade of orange, and the sun shone through a thick, smoky atmosphere. It wasn't the home she had known, that was certain. This planet, with its wild landscape and unfamiliar colors, looked nothing like her world. But it was now her home, at least for the time being. Lyra stumbled out of the wreckage, her mind racing. The ground beneath her was uneven, and jagged rocks scattered the terrain. The air was thick, with dust swirling around her, making it hard to breathe. She could feel the weight of isolation pressing down on her. The ship was beyond repair, and the communication systems were down. She had no way to call for help. As she took a few shaky steps forward, she glanced back at the wreckage. It had been a rough landing, but she had survived. Her body ached, and her heart felt heavy, but there was no time to waste. She needed to find shelter, and more importantly, she needed to figure out how to survive on this unknown world. She couldn't stay here. If she did, she would perish. Lyra took a deep breath, pushing the fear aside. She had always been resourceful, quick to adapt when faced with challenges. She wasn't going to let this planet defeat her. But first, she needed to find safety. The harsh wind whipped through the rocky landscape as Lyra walked on. After a while, she found a small cave in the side of a cliff. It wasn't much, but it would offer some protection from the harsh weather. She gathered what little strength she had left and crawled inside, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. As she settled into the dark, cold cave, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced around nervously but saw nothing. The world outside felt different, alive, almost as if the planet itself was waiting, watching her every move. She tried to ignore the unsettling feeling in her gut, but it stayed with her, a constant reminder that she was not alone. Minutes turned into hours, and Lyra drifted in and out of sleep, her body still aching from the crash. She knew she couldn't stay in the cave forever. She had to explore, to figure out if there was anything, or anyone, else on this strange world. And then, in the distance, she heard a sound, a crackling noise, like something brushing against rocks. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then it grew louder. Her heart raced. What was it? Was someone Something nearby. She held her breath and listened carefully. The sound came again, this time closer. Her pulse quickened, and she instinctively reached for a piece of broken metal from the ship's wreckage. Was it a predator? Another exile alien? Or worse, was it a hostile force? She didn't know, but she had to find out. Liara's heart raced as she carefully peered out of the cave entrance, her mind trying to make sense of the strange sounds. The wind had calmed, but the crackling noise continued, growing louder with each passing moment. She gripped the sharp piece of metal tightly, ready to defend herself if whatever was out there decided to attack. She had spent the past few hours recovering from the crash and trying to gather her thoughts, but the uncertainty of the unknown planet had kept her on edge. The possibility of facing predators or hostile beings in this strange land made her even more fearful, but she couldn't stay hidden forever. If she was going to survive here, she had to face whatever was coming. As the sound drew closer, Lara finally saw movement through the misty air. A figure, small but steady, was walking toward her cave. The figure stopped for a moment, scanning the area as if searching for something. It wasn't the usual creature or predator she had expected. This one was different. It didn't look like an animal, nor did it seem to be a threat. Curiosity overpowered her fear, and Lyra cautiously stepped out of the cave, still holding the sharp metal piece tightly in her hand. She squinted through the fog, trying to get a clearer view. The figure appeared to be human. Strange, considering she hadn't expected any other living beings on this planet. The man looked just as surprised as she did when he saw her standing there. His clothes were worn and covered in dirt, and his face looked tired but determined. He had a rugged appearance, as though he had been surviving here for quite some time. His eyes scanned her, and for a brief moment, Lyra saw a flash of confusion in them. Liara didn't know what to expect from this human. Her people had always spoken of humans with a mix of awe and fear, and now here was one standing in front of her, looking just as lost as she felt. There was no time to waste. She needed to figure out if he was a threat, or if he could help her. The silence stretched between them, both unsure of how to break it. Finally, the man spoke, his voice rough from what seemed like a long time without speaking. "You're not from here, are you?" he asked, his gaze fixed on her with cautious curiosity. Lara hesitated before answering. "No," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I crashed here. I'm not supposed to be on this planet." He nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I figured as much. This planet isn't exactly friendly to newcomers." He shifted on his feet, as though deciding whether or not to step closer. "I'm John, by the way." Liara watched him closely. She had heard of humans before, many stories told by her people, but she had never met one in person. She had no idea what kind of person John might be. But right now, she didn't have much of a choice. "I'm Lyra," she said. Her voice was steady, though she was unsure of what to say next. She had to make a decision quickly. Should she trust him, or was it too dangerous to let her guard down? John seemed to sense her hesitation. "Look, I'm not here to hurt you," he said, holding up his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I've been on this planet for a long time. I know how to survive here. If you're stuck, I can help." Lyra's first instinct was to refuse. She had always been taught to be wary of others, especially humans, who had a reputation for being unpredictable. But then she realized that she had no other choice. The crash had destroyed her ship, and the planet was far too dangerous for her to wander alone. If she wanted to survive, she had to trust him. "I don't have any other choice," she said quietly, her voice resigned. "I need help." John nodded, as if he had expected her answer. "Good. We can work together. But first, we should get you to a safe place. There are creatures out here that will kill you if you're not careful." With that, he motioned for her to follow. Lyra hesitated for a moment before stepping out from the cave, her eyes scanning the area around her. She knew she had to stay alert. The planet was full of unknown dangers, and now she was relying on a stranger for help. John led the way through the rocky terrain, his movements confident and sure. Lyra followed closely behind, trying to keep up despite her exhaustion. As they walked, he spoke to her, explaining the basics of surviving on the planet. "Stay close to the caves at night," John advised, his voice calm and steady. "The larger predators come out after dark. They're not as active during the day, but they can still be a problem if you're not careful. Also, don't drink from the streams unless you've boiled the water. It's not safe." Lyra listened carefully, absorbing every word. She had always been trained in advanced technology and space exploration, but this planet was different. Nothing here made sense. It was raw and untamed, and she would need to adapt quickly if she wanted to survive. As they made their way through the rocky landscape, Lyra couldn't help but feel a growing sense of gratitude toward John. He was showing her how to survive, even when she had no idea where to begin. She realized then that despite the unknowns, she wasn't alone on this strange planet anymore. With John's help, maybe she could start to build a new life here. Lyra followed John through the rocky terrain as they made their way deeper into the unknown wilderness of the planet. The landscape was strange, with towering cliffs and dense patches of dark, twisted trees that seemed to grow in all directions. The air was thick with dust, and every step they took felt like they were walking through a dream, a place completely unlike her home. As they walked, John continued to talk, explaining more about the planet's dangers and how to stay safe. His words were calm, but Lyra could sense that he was experienced. He knew this planet well, which made her feel both grateful and a little uneasy. The thought of relying on someone she had just met was strange, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that her options were limited. "There's a place I stay at, not too far from here," John said, breaking the silence. "It's a small shelter. It's not much, but it's safe from the creatures at night." Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the area. The air was quiet, but there was an underlying tension. It felt like something was watching them. She couldn't shake the feeling that this planet was alive, that the rocks and trees themselves were aware of their presence, but she didn't voice her thoughts. For now, she needed to trust John. He had already saved her from being stranded alone, and she wasn't about to push him away. As they continued walking, John led her toward a small hill where a cave entrance appeared hidden behind a cluster of large boulders. It wasn't much, but it looked like a decent shelter, and Lyra was thankful for it. She had no idea how long she would have lasted on her own, but with John's help, her chances of survival had greatly increased. John walked ahead, pulling away the boulders with ease. His strength seemed effortless, and Lyra couldn't help but admire his determination. It was clear that he had learned how to survive in this harsh world, and she would need to learn from him if she wanted to make it through. Once inside, John set down his pack and motioned for her to sit on a flat rock near the back of the cave. Lyra did as he instructed, feeling the weight of exhaustion in her limbs. The crash, the long walk, and the strange new world had drained her. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself a brief moment of rest. "Thanks," she said softly, looking up at John. "I didn't think anyone could live on a planet like this. It's so different." John smiled faintly, his eyes glancing around the cave. "Yeah, it's not exactly a walk in the park, but it's home. It's rough, but you get used to it." Lyra studied him for a moment, her curiosity growing. "How did you end up here?" she asked. "Why are you on this planet?" John paused, his expression darkening slightly. For a moment, he didn't answer, as though lost in thought. Lyra waited patiently, sensing that there was more to his story than he was letting on. "I wasn't supposed to be here either," John said finally, his voice low. "I was part of a rescue mission. We were supposed to pick up a team stranded on this planet, but the ship got hit by some kind of storm, and we crashed. The rest of my crew, they didn't make it." Lyra felt a pang of sympathy for him. She had been exiled from her people, but at least she wasn't the only one stranded in this strange place. John had been part of something important, and now he, too, was left to survive alone. She knew how that felt. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. John gave a small nod. "It's been a long time since I talked about it. Anyway, enough about me. I'm just glad you're safe for now." Liara nodded, grateful for his understanding. It was clear that John wasn't the type to share his past easily, but she appreciated that he was helping her without asking for anything in return. The evening passed quickly, with John showing Liara the basics of living on the planet. They gathered some food from nearby plants, fruits and edible roots that were safe to eat, and they spent some time starting a fire to cook. Liara marveled at how quickly John adapted to the world around them, as though he had become one with the planet itself. As night began to fall, the temperature dropped and the cave grew colder. Liara wrapped herself in a blanket John had found earlier, trying to get comfortable on the hard ground. Despite the rough conditions, she felt safer now than she had since the crash. With John by her side, she wasn't alone, and for the first time since arriving on the planet, she felt a small spark of hope. "Tomorrow, we'll need to go find fresh water," John said as he lay down nearby, his voice low but steady. "I know where there's a stream about a day's walk from here." Liara nodded, her eyelids heavy. "Okay," she whispered, grateful for his guidance. As she closed her eyes, the cave was quiet except for the sound of the wind outside. She felt herself drifting off to sleep, and in the comfort of John's presence, she allowed herself to relax. For the first time since her exile, she felt a glimmer of peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now she could rest, safe, for the moment, on this strange planet. The morning light filtered softly into the cave, casting faint shadows against the rough stone walls. Liara woke up, stretching her stiff limbs. She had slept through the night without interruption, and for the first time since the crash, she felt a sense of relief. The cave, though humble, had provided shelter from the dangers outside. But as the sun climbed higher, Liara's mind quickly turned back to the pressing issue: survival. John had already stirred and was preparing their small camp. His movements were quick and purposeful, showing that he had done this countless times before. Liara watched him for a moment, still amazed by his skill in this harsh environment. Despite the challenges, he seemed to have everything under control. "Good morning," she said softly as she sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. John glanced over his shoulder, offering a brief smile. "Morning. Ready to go find that water?" Liara nodded. "Yes, I'm ready." The morning air was crisp, and the landscape around them was still bathed in the early light of the day. John packed up their supplies, and together, they set out from the shelter. Liara couldn't help but notice how different everything looked in the daylight. The towering trees, the rocky ground. Everything felt so strange, yet it was becoming more familiar with each step. John led the way as they trekked across the rugged terrain. He moved with ease, as though he had memorized every curve and edge of the landscape. Liara followed closely behind, careful not to trip on the uneven ground. It was clear that this planet wasn't just difficult for survival. It was wild, unpredictable, and constantly changing. But John had a calm, steady pace that made Liara feel more at ease. "Do you come this way often?" Liara asked, trying to break the silence. John glanced back at her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been to the stream a few times. It's one of the few safe places around here, but there are other dangers between here and there. That's why we need to stay alert." Liara nodded, her senses sharp. The air around them felt thick with tension, like the land itself was watching them. Though she wasn't as familiar with the planet as John, her instincts as a trained explorer kicked in. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking nearby. As they walked, they came across a dense forest. The trees here were enormous, their twisted branches stretching far above their heads, creating a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The ground was covered in moss, and the air felt damp and cool. John stopped for a moment, scanning the area. "This is where it gets tricky," he said quietly. "The creatures that live here are stealthy. They won't attack unless they think you're a threat. but we don't want to take chances. Liara kept close to John, her eyes moving over the trees. She hadn't seen any creatures yet, but she could feel their presence. There was something about the silence in the forest that made her uneasy. It was as though the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the edge of the forest. Ahead of them, the land sloped down into a small valley where a crystal-clear stream flowed peacefully through the rocks. Liara's heart lifted at the sight of it. Water. Fresh, clean water. It was the first real sign of hope she'd seen since the crash. "We made it," John said, his voice almost relieved. "The stream's safe. Drink up." Liara didn't need to be told twice. She knelt beside the water, cupping her hands to drink. The cool liquid was like nothing she had tasted before. It was pure, refreshing, and exactly what she needed. She drank deeply, feeling the weight of exhaustion slowly lift from her shoulders. When she looked up, John was standing a few feet away, scanning the area with a careful eye. His presence reminded her that they weren't out of danger yet. The peaceful stream was a welcome sight, but the planet still held its dangers, hidden just out of sight. "Take what you need," John said, his voice steady as ever. "We should head back soon." Liara nodded, filling their water containers before standing up. She felt stronger already, the water giving her the energy she had been missing. It was the first step toward recovering from the crash, and toward rebuilding her hope. As they began to head back to the shelter, Liara felt a sense of gratitude for John. She had been alone for so long, and now, with his help, she had learned to navigate this strange world. She knew there was still much to face, but for the first time since the crash, she felt a little less alone. They'd retraced their steps through the forest and back toward the cave, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The land around them remained as harsh and wild as ever, but with John by her side, Liara began to see it in a new light. It wasn't just a hostile place. It was a world full of opportunities, waiting for those brave enough to adapt. As they neared the shelter, Liara glanced over at John. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for showing me this, for helping me." John gave her a small smile. "No need to thank me. We're in this together." Liara nodded, feeling a bond growing between them. She wasn't sure what the future held or how long she would remain stranded on this planet, but with John's guidance, she felt more capable of facing whatever came next. The journey ahead would be difficult, but together, they would find a way to survive. The days were starting to blur together as Liara and John continued their life on the strange planet. The shelter, while small and humble, had become their haven. It protected them from the harsh winds and the lurking dangers outside. Still, every day felt like a challenge, and every moment they spent on this planet reminded Liara of how far she was from home. Today, however, was different. John had mentioned a supply run to gather more resources, and Liara knew it was time to take another step into the unknown. The small supplies they had gathered so far wouldn't last forever, and they had to be prepared for what was to come. "We'll need to go deeper into the forest today," John explained as they packed their gear. "There's a place where we can find berries, roots, and maybe some fresh game. But it's not an easy journey." Liara nodded, tightening her pack straps. "I'm ready," she said, though a part of her felt the unease creep up again. She had become more familiar with the dangers of the planet, but that didn't make them less intimidating. The creatures in the forest were unpredictable, and the planet had a way of making even the most experienced wanderer feel like a newcomer. As they made their way into the forest, the air seemed thicker, heavier. The trees loomed over them, casting long shadows. Liara could feel her senses sharpening with every step. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched. There was something else, something she couldn't quite place, but it made her skin prickle. John moved with confidence, but even he couldn't hide the tension in his posture. His eyes scanned every movement in the forest. They had learned to be silent, their footsteps careful to avoid alerting any of the predators that roamed the area. Liara followed close behind, trying to stay alert, but her thoughts kept drifting to the journey that had brought her here, the crash, her exile, and the strange new world that had become her home. After what felt like hours, they reached the spot John had mentioned, a patch of land dotted with wild berries and plants that would help them survive. The air smelled earthy, filled with the scent of the plants and the soil. Lyra knelt down, her hands brushing the leaves, as she carefully plucked the ripened fruit. It wasn't much, but it would help. As she worked, she noticed how John had already set out to gather roots from nearby plants. Suddenly, she heard a rustling sound. It was faint, but Lyra froze, her heart beating faster. John had heard it too. He stood still, his hand raised in a signal for silence. The two of them held their breath, trying to listen for any signs of movement. Something moved in the brush nearby. It was large and fast, its movements quick and unpredictable. Lyra's eyes widened as she watched it. It was a creature unlike any she had ever seen, a giant, furry animal with glowing yellow eyes. It sniffed the air, sensing their presence, but it didn't move toward them. John slowly lowered his hand and gave a slight nod, signaling Lyra to stay still. The creature paused, looking directly at them, its muscles tense and ready to spring. Lyra's heart raced as she locked eyes with it. She could see the wildness in its gaze, the hunger. "We can't fight it," John whispered. "If it's hungry, it'll be dangerous." They waited, not daring to make a sound. The creature seemed to hesitate, its instincts unsure. After what felt like an eternity, it turned away, its large body disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Only then did Lyra release the breath she had been holding. She looked at John, who remained calm, though his eyes showed a hint of tension. "That was too close," she said quietly. John nodded, his gaze still fixed on the spot where the creature had disappeared. "It's always like this. The planet doesn't give anything for free, but we've got what we need for now. Let's head back." They quickly gathered the remaining supplies, moving silently through the forest as they retraced their steps. The encounter with the creature had reminded Lyra just how dangerous this planet was. Even with John's knowledge and experience, they weren't safe. Every moment was a risk, and survival depended on staying alert and being prepared for anything. The journey back was quieter, but Lyra couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees seemed to close in around them, and every rustling sound made her heart race. She didn't know if it was the same creature or something else, but it felt as if the forest was alive, constantly shifting, always watching. When they reached the shelter, John let out a sigh of relief. They had made it back without incident, but the danger was always there, lurking just outside. Lyra's hands trembled as she set down her pack. The weight of the day's journey seemed to settle on her shoulders, and for a moment, she couldn't help but feel the crushing reality of their situation. "We're safe for now," John said, noticing her exhaustion. "But we'll have to go out again soon." Lyra nodded, though the thought of facing more dangers weighed heavily on her. But she had no choice. She had come to depend on John, and together they had a better chance of surviving. With each passing day, the planet felt less like an enemy and more like an unpredictable ally, offering both challenges and rewards. Lyra glanced at John, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere, "for everything." John looked at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes softening. "We're in this together." As night fell and the fire flickered in their shelter, Lyra realized that though the future was uncertain, she wasn't facing it alone. With John by her side, they would continue to face whatever came next on this strange and dangerous planet. The days had grown longer, and the two of them, Lyra and John, had gotten used to the rhythm of life on the strange planet. Each day presented new challenges, but it was also a chance to learn more about the land, its resources, and the creatures that roamed it. They had become a team, working together to survive. Every new discovery brought them closer, and with each passing moment, the strange planet felt a little less foreign. Today was different. John had a look in his eyes, a kind of spark that Lyra couldn't ignore. He had discovered something important. As they prepared for another supply run, John seemed more excited than usual. "We're going deeper today," John said, his voice full of energy. "I think I found something that might change everything." Lyra tilted her head, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" "You'll see," John replied with a grin. "Just trust me." The journey took them into a part of the forest they hadn't explored before. The trees were taller here, their trunks thick and ancient-looking. The air felt heavier, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Lyra couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as they walked deeper into the unknown. But John's enthusiasm was contagious, and she pushed her doubts aside, following him. As they walked, John pointed out the signs that indicated the area was rich with resources. There were unusual plants and strange markings on the trees that seemed to suggest they were heading in the right direction. Lyra found herself growing more and more curious about what John had found. After a long walk, they came to a clearing. The sunlight broke through the canopy above, casting rays of golden light across the ground. In the middle of the clearing, Lyra saw it, a large, smooth stone structure half buried in the earth. The stone was unlike anything she had ever seen, its surface shimmering as though it had been crafted by hands from another world. John approached the structure cautiously, his eyes wide with awe. "This is it," he whispered. "I've never seen anything like it before." Lyra stepped closer, her heart racing. She could sense something ancient about the stone. It was as if it had been here for centuries, forgotten by time. The markings on the stone glowed faintly, and for a moment, Lyra felt a strange connection to it. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing the smooth surface. "Do you think it's a relic?" Lyra asked, her voice barely a whisper. John nodded. "It's possible. This could be from the ancient inhabitants of the planet. I've heard rumors of lost civilizations. If we can figure out how to open it, we might find something useful inside." Lyra's heart skipped a beat at the thought. If this was really from a lost civilization, it could hold the key to their survival. There could be technology, knowledge, or even weapons hidden inside. But it was clear that opening the stone structure wouldn't be easy. John circled the stone, examining it carefully. "There must be a way to unlock it," he muttered to himself. He pressed his hands against the surface, feeling for any buttons, switches, or hidden mechanisms. Lyra watched him, waiting anxiously for any sign of progress. After a few tense moments, John's eyes lit up. He had found something. A small indentation on the side of the stone structure, almost invisible to the naked eye. He pressed it gently, and the stone shifted with a low rumble. Lyra stepped back in surprise, watching as the surface of the stone began to move, revealing a dark opening inside. "John, you did it," Lyra exclaimed. John grinned, his excitement growing. "Let's see what's inside." The opening was narrow, but just wide enough for them to squeeze through. With their hearts pounding, they stepped inside the dark space. The air inside was cooler, and the smell of old stone and earth filled their noses. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they could make out strange symbols on the walls, glowing faintly like the markings on the stone outside. They moved deeper into the structure, the narrow passageway leading them into a larger chamber. In the center of the chamber was a pedestal, and on it rested a small object. It was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen, a smooth metallic orb, its surface reflecting the dim light in strange patterns. John approached the pedestal carefully, his fingers trembling as he reached out to touch the orb. The moment his hand made contact, the chamber seemed to come alive. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, and the orb hummed with an energy that sent a shiver down Lyra's spine. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. John didn't answer at first. He seemed lost in the moment, his eyes fixed on the orb. Then, slowly, he turned to Lyra, a look of wonder in his eyes. I think this is it. This is the key. The key to what? Lyra asked, confused. I don't know yet, John replied, his voice filled with excitement. But I can feel it. This orb, it's important. It could be the key to understanding the technology of the ancient civilization, or even the key to leaving this planet. Lyra's mind raced. The possibilities were endless. She looked at the orb in John's hands, wondering what mysteries it held. If this was the key to escaping the planet, to finding a way home, it would change everything. As they stood there in the quiet, the orb glowing softly in John's hands, Lyra realized that their journey was far from over. It was just beginning. The moment the orb touched John's hand, the air around them seemed to hum with energy. Lyra could feel the change, the atmosphere charged with something ancient and powerful. It was as though the planet itself was watching them, waiting for what would happen next. John stared at the orb, his fingers lightly tracing its surface. I don't understand, but I can feel it. There's something alive in it. Lyra stepped closer, her heart racing with both fear and excitement. The orb wasn't just a key. It was something far more complex, something that connected to the planet itself. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing the smooth surface beside John's hand. As soon as her touch met the orb, a bright light exploded from it, filling the chamber with an intense glow. The walls seemed to pulse with life, and Lyra's mind spun with possibilities. What had they unlocked? Was this a message? A warning? John pulled back, shielding his eyes from the light. But even as he stepped back, the light didn't fade. Instead, it became more focused, forming shapes, symbols, and patterns that danced across the walls of the chamber. It's trying to tell us something, John said, his voice trembling with awe. These symbols, they're from the ancient people of this planet. This is their message. Lyra watched the glowing symbols on the walls, trying to make sense of them. They were unlike anything she had seen before, an intricate language of lines, shapes, and curves. Each symbol seemed to shimmer with meaning, but it was impossible to understand. I don't know how to read it, Lyra said, frustration creeping into her voice. What does it mean? What are they trying to say? John didn't answer at first. He was staring at the glowing patterns, his mind racing. Then suddenly he stepped forward, his hand hovering over the symbols. With a deep breath, he began to speak. I don't know how I know this, but I think I can hear them. Their voices in my head. They're reaching out. They want us to understand. Lyra's eyes widened. She had heard stories of telepathic communication, of ancient civilizations communicating through thoughts and emotions. But this was beyond anything she could have imagined. John, are you okay? She asked, stepping closer. She could see the strain in his face, as if he was hearing something no one else could. His hand trembled as he continued to move through the symbols, tracing the glowing lines in the air. I'm not sure. It's like their voices are overlapping. It's overwhelming. But there's a message, a warning. He paused, his eyes unfocused. The planet is dying. It's been dying for centuries. Lyra felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected that the planet wasn't as stable as it seemed, but to hear it confirmed was terrifying. If the ancient people had left a message, it meant they knew the planet's time was running out. And yet, the orb was still glowing with life. How do we stop it? Lyra asked urgently. Can we save it? John took a deep breath, his eyes still unfocused. He spoke slowly, as though the words were being drawn from somewhere deep within him. They've left us the answer. The orb is the key, but it's only part of it. We need to activate the network, their hidden technology scattered across the planet. Only then can we restore the balance. Lyra felt a weight settle on her shoulders. This was it, the chance to change everything. If they could follow the ancient people's instructions and restore the planet's health, they might be able to survive here, even thrive. But it wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more risks, and more unknowns ahead. John turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers with a newfound determination. We can do this. Together. Liara nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of hope and resolve. For so long, she had felt lost on this strange planet, unsure of her future, of her place in the universe. But now she realized something. They weren't just survivors. They were part of something bigger, something important. Together, they had the power to rewrite the future. The orb continued to pulse in John's hand, its light slowly dimming as the chamber's energy began to calm. But the symbols on the walls remained, their meaning now clear in John's mind. They had a path to follow, a purpose to fulfill. We need to find the others, John said, looking around the chamber. There's more to this, more we need to uncover, and we don't have much time. Lara looked at him, determination shining in her eyes. Then we better start moving. With the orb in hand and the weight of the ancient civilization's message on their shoulders, they left the chamber, stepping back into the bright sunlight of the strange planet. It felt like a new beginning. As they walked together, side by side, Lyra couldn't help but think of how far they had come. She had been in exile, a stranger on this alien world. But now she wasn't alone. She had a partner, a friend, and maybe, just maybe, a way to make things right. The journey ahead would be hard, filled with challenges, unknown dangers, and untold mysteries. But for the first time since she had crash-landed on this strange world, Lyra felt ready to face whatever came next. Together, they could change the fate of the planet, and maybe even their own.